Today, what will Rishi Sunak be asked about the Tory chairman's taxes at PMQs? Should people be charged to see a GP? And should users of Class A drugs be prosecuted? This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Miriam Cates, the former Labour Home Secretary David Blunkett, the SNP's David Linden and Anne Widdecombe, former Conservative Minister and Brexit Party MEP. Today.
Clearly in this case there are questions that need answering, and that's why I've asked our independent advisor to get to the bottom of everything.
The Prime Minister now says that this member of his cabinet does have questions to answer about his tax affairs. Keir Starmer will put those to Rishi Sunak, no doubt, at PMQs, live at midday.
We've certainly had the worst ever December we've had. If you look at performance figures on every metric, what went on in December was terrible.
With the NHS facing unprecedented pressure, a former health secretary says people should be charged to see their GP.
The idea of linking trans people with predators, frankly, is disgusting, and you should be ashamed.
That's what a Labour MP said to my guest, Miriam Cates, last week. Why has the debate on transgender rights become so heated? And should people be prosecuted when they're found in possession of Class A drugs? Lots to talk about, but let's start with the economy and a few of the front pages. Looking at public sector borrowing figures, you can see here in the Times, economy is failing to bounce back fast enough. This was the headline on the front page of the Eye. You can see here, Treasury rules out tax cuts. This is ahead of the budget on the 15th of March after being surprised by UK's record borrowing. A different tack, though, in The Telegraph. Their headline says Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, urged to cut taxes after burden on households rises by £821. My opening question to the panel is, can Jeremy Hunt afford to cut taxes in the upcoming budget, Miriam?
Probably not by very much, I don't think, no. Not. I think we should be looking at how we distribute the tax burden and take the burden off young people and families. But probably at the moment we can't afford to cut taxes overall. And
just briefly, how would you do that with the triple lock in place for people on pensions, of course? How would you redistribute it?
Well, for example, at the moment in this country, unlike in an awful lot of other Western countries, we tax everybody as an individual. We only see people as individuals, whereas in other countries they see people as households. So you might tax a couple together and take into account how many children they have. So the tax burden on families in this country is several times what it is in other countries, and that creates cliff edges of its own, people not wanting promotions and things like that. So you could solve some productivity issues as well as making it easier for families by just slightly redistributing how you operate the tax system.
David, can Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, afford to cut taxes, which is what a lot of Conservative MPs would like, including Miriam Cates, by the sounds of it?
Well, I think what we'd like and what is possible are two entirely different things, as we saw in September. With the 23rd of September budget, which, by the way, has had an impact on the borrowing figures because it's increased the rate that we're now being charged in terms of international borrowing. The truth is, it's a waste of space having a budget at all in March. We should just...
Is it?
Yeah, because we had the mini budget, or so-called autumn, whatever it was, statement in November.
It wasn't very mini, but yes.
Well, it wasn't,
no.
And exactly. So they've set a course, they've indicated their spending levels. What is there to say in March other than to reinforce the misery?
Right, well, I'm sure Jeremy Hunt will find something to say. Do you think the UK government can afford to cut taxes in the budget?
Well, I'd like to know why we have this obsession about cutting taxes, because if you want to have good public services, you've got to pay for it. Now, in Scotland, we want to see a proper pay rise for public sector workers. We're constrained by many of the fiscal powers being here at Westminster. But the very key workers that we clapped during the pandemic, the government is now looking to sack through its forced working bill on strikes that comes next week. And let's not forget that the trouble that the UK economy is in at the moment is precisely because of that economic experiment with Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, that Tufton Street economics, which went so badly, and why so many of your viewers, Jo, are having to pay higher mortgage rates as a result of that.
Much of that was reversed, of course, quite quickly, but I take back yours and David point. Just a question about your constituents. Are they as relaxed as you are about the tax burden on them in Scotland?
Well, many of my constituents are public sector workers, and rightly, people were going out
so they are relaxed about the high tax burden?
No, I think many of my constituents want to have a good pay rise, make sure that they can make ends meet when it comes to the bills that are coming through the door. We've seen the data from ASDA, for example, showing that people have less disposable income in Scotland, I think £23–25 a week. That could only be happened if we get more money into people's pay packets.
Anne, what do you think in terms of cutting taxes and what David is saying, that actually people can't have good public services without high taxes?
Well, and that is completely wrong. The only way you get good public services is through growth. And whatever is said about Liz Truss, and she did blunder in, it was like a bull in a china shop, and it was handled abominably. But that aside, the policy of going for growth is the only thing that's going to control inflation, the only thing that's going to reduce borrowing. And one of the ways that you go for growth is through becoming competitive, and no country with a high tax economy is competitive.
You would say it is a high tax economy. Would you like to see Jeremy Hunt cut taxes then in March?
Yes, I would like to see him do that, but I don't believe he'll have the guts.
But how can we deal with issues around the NHS?
Well, hang on, let David come in. I'll come back to you, David.
Miriam and I might agree on this. A substantial investment into parts of our country which have missed out. Last week's Levelling Up Part 2 completely missed Yorkshire. 120 million, I think we got, which was less than 10.
Didn't completely miss Yorkshire. I think they got some money, didn't they?
I think David has a point, and I think we can say both that the tax burden is too high, which I think is true, and I think some of that is actually fiscal drag rather than tax rate. So it's ridiculous that
so people being pulled into
pay
a higher rate
of tax now. It's a huge cliff edge, particularly for families. So we can say the tax burden is too high. It is, but we can also say that the demand on our public services is so high that we also can't afford to reduce the tax burden. Now, Anne is right. We need growth, but that growth has to be about producing our own stuff in Yorkshire, in the formerly industrialised north, in proper growth that creates proper jobs.
So is that a failure of a Conservative government not to actually meet the ambition?
I think it's a failure of successive governments and a political
Conservative
class
governments since 2010.
Well, and going back further than that has allowed the economy to grow through the expansion of London and the South East, but for us to become one of the most regionally imbalanced economies in the Western world.
Well, we could agree on that last point.
All right, well, we'll hold that for a moment. Let me. You brought up the issue, all of you, in one way or another, about how to fund public services. Miriam has just mentioned that the demand is increasing no more than in the health service. If we have a look at the Times, Sajid Javid, a former health secretary, says we need to agree a new NHS future or the 1948 dream dies, when the National Health Service was set up. What were you saying, Anne?
I said yes, quite.
You do. What does that look like, Anne?
Right. 24 years ago, that's nearly a quarter of a century ago, I said when I was Shadow Health Secretary in my party conference speech that the NHS would not be able to last in its present form, and that what we should do was to have a very open, mature debate, asking ourselves one very simple question. Not how do we tinker with what we've got, but rather, if we were setting up a health service from scratch now, knowing what we know now, which we could not have known.
So the demand and ageing population and so on and so forth,
ageing population, demand, all the rest of it. What would we do? And then you'd have to ask yourself the even bigger question, how the heck do we get there from here?
Right, but what would you do?
But we're not... Hang on. You see, this is the problem. Everybody's got their own favoured solution. What we actually need to look at are all the possibilities, crucially looking at other countries, crucially looking at other countries.
Sajid Javid does do that.
That's called for privatisation.
Well, you say it's called privatisation, but just before you get into the privatisation and private outsourcing debate, let's just focus a little bit on what Sajid Javid was looking at. He did look at other countries. He looked at Ireland, or an example from Ireland. Some people are entitled to free healthcare through the public system based on household income. Others must pay nominal fees. One, he says, is a €75 charge if you attend an injury unit without a referral from a GP. In Norway and Sweden, a visit to the GP comes with a contribution of about £20. Would you like to see people, David Blunkett, pay to see their GP?
Well, I read Sajid's article,
You say no.
and he starts off by saying it's not about money. and then he talks about how to raise money as an alternative to tax and national insurance. And so it's going to come from somewhere. And if you penalise people for going to a service, then inevitably you're trying to discourage people from taking it up. There can be no other reason. Otherwise, why not use progressive taxation to raise the money? There is an underlying issue that he raises, which Anne touched upon. I was, as well as Anne, I was Shadow Health Secretary back in the 90s, advocating reform then, and as West Streeting is now, saying we can't just solve this by chucking more money at it. There's got to be a root and branch reform of the service from beginning to end.
Yes. Well,
and that's not about structures. We've had 2 restructuring.
Well, I was going to say top-down organisation.
In the last 10 years. This is about how the service operates.
Right.
And I ought to declare interest because until 3 years ago, my wife was a GP.
Right. Okay.
And so I wouldn't be against actually penalising people who don't turn up for GP appointments that they've made, because it absolutely jiggers the primary care practices.
Right, I'm going to bring the other two, but can I clarify what you... Because you said no to charging to see a GP.
No.
Charging for any of the services, though?
No, I haven't said no.
No, that's what I'm saying. I want to clarify.
Yeah. Tinkering is what I call charging to see a GP, and there are 2 big objections to it. The first is at the margins, where you get people who would be above the level for help, but where it would actually matter. But crucially, it would involve such a lot of administration that it would outdo the benefits. You need a complete reform, not to tinker.
Right. So how would it be funded? As you said, David, we heard Sajid Javid saying it's not about money. David Linden, you said Anne is talking about privatisation. On the basis of what?
I mean, be wary of a former Chancellor that comes talking about how to operate the NHS, because former Chancellors always look at ways of raising money. The reality is I have this very unusual belief, apparently, that the NHS should be free at the point of need. You know, in Scotland, we have free eye tests, we have free prescriptions.
Yes.
In fact, they're not free insofar as we pay for them through our taxes. That is a social contract that we've got with the state. But the minute that we start asking people to pay for the NHS, it just starts to prove many of the things that we warned about in 2014 when Gordon Brown, for example, was saying that privatisation of the NHS was nationalist fear-mongering. And then, of course, he's in The Guardian just this week saying that the NHS is now at risk in Conservative hands. So they're absolutely right.
Yes, but he's not advocating...
Why are you confusing Bevan's vision with his vehicle? His vision, which we all share, is that nobody should be denied healthcare because they can't afford it. The vehicle, no, let me finish, and then you can... The vehicle he chose to deliver that, not the central principle, but the vehicle was therefore everything free at the point of reception. The vehicle has broken down. People who can afford to pay should contribute something.
The thing is, Anne, we're all living longer, that is a good thing, but we're living longer with health conditions, and we have just got to accept that as a result of that, there is going to be more pressure on the NHS. The NHS is a public service that we pay for. That's the fundamental difference between you and I.
Those who can afford to pay should pay something.
We're in a situation where everybody has to be treated equally. That is the fundamental point here.
No, that is not the fundamental point. That was never the fundamental point. The fundamental point was to prevent healthcare being denied to people just because they couldn't afford it. It was never to let the billionaires of this world get free NHS treatment.
Well, the billionaires of this world, for example, our Prime Minister Rishi Sunak doesn't appear to use the NHS very often. So this is the problem: is we have a Conservative government that is so obsessed with privatisation it doesn't even use the damn service.
Hang on. The Conservative government hasn't advocated privatisation. We have also had
they're certainly running up the flagpole this week.
And we've had a Labour Party under West Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, also looking at alternatives, wanting to scrap the existing GP model, the sort of private practice way it is set up, and also increasing outsourcing because of the crisis the NHS is in. Should people contribute, Miriam, in some way if they can afford to?
Well, I certainly think we should look at that model. And the reason is, if the only funding for our health service comes from the taxpayer, then that automatically limits the amount of money that can be spent on health. And in other countries, if you have a combination of insurance and taxpayer funded, you can increase the overall health budget.
So you're sympathetic to what Sajid Javid is suggesting?
I think he's got some very good points. And I think this is why...
To look at some people contributing in the way I've outlined.
Yes, for example, that they already do. So there are plenty of schemes that, for example, even trade unions use, where they will pay a small amount of money a month and their employees get access to, for example, private physiotherapy, private occupational health. Now, we don't seem to have a problem with that. It adds to the overall health budget. Why not use that system if it takes pressure off the NHS?
The whole cake.
And that is completely different from saying that it shouldn't be free at the point of use. And I think the problem is that when we get into these debates, I'm afraid the left use these lazy arguments that say, well, Gordon Brown says in his article, neoliberals seem to find more joy in one person joining Bupa than 60 million people using the NHS. That's not an argument.
But Miriam Cates, that is one part of what Gordon Brown says. But actually, in the piece, he says, mark my words, the Guardian headline, we can show you here, this will be the end of the NHS if the Tories have their way. But hang on, he is advocating, I looked at it, a comprehensive funding settlement, increasing spending on the NHS by 6% a year.
And what public service are you going
to
cut to pay for that?
David?
Well, we actually were putting 6.2%
which
average.
Is what he says.
Yeah, between 2000 and 2010. So we were actually doing it, and we'd reduced waiting lists dramatically from 18 months to 8 weeks. We'd reduced the people waiting for cancer down to 2 weeks. What we've seen is a complete reversal of that. All the things that were achieved in that decade have now been reversed. And we've got, of course, we must reform, but the idea that you can find money from somewhere else rather than tax and national insurance is merely shifting it onto private insurance rather than the national insurance.
And this is part of the problem. This is what we warned about in 2014. And less than 10 years later, we're sitting here in a BBC studio in London talking about how we fund the NHS and looking at models of privatisation. And it only makes the point that the only reason that we don't want to have Westminster in control of Scotland's NHS and the funding arrangements associated with that.
You do run the NHS.
We do, but the reality is that we operate with one hand tied.
Yeah,
indeed we do.
And
we don't have strikes at the moment, but
you have had them.
But David, we have to be honest about the issues here. And in 1948, life expectancy was 65. Well, most people started work at 15 and spent the vast majority of their life economically active. Now you might not start work till you're 22, and you might live to 90 and spend over half your life economically inactive and taking advantage of some incredible and expensive advances in healthcare. It's a fundamentally different model. It's a fundamentally different situation than we had in 1948.
On declining demand. I mean, Miriam's
but what
right,
about Gordon Brown's? But David Blunkett is right. There was greater satisfaction with the NHS. The public at that point were behind paying more in income tax to fund the NHS and education. Why not do that now?
But in the last 20 years, people have become older, with more complex health needs. We'd have an increase in family breakdown, in all kinds of other things that increase the demand on the NHS. We've also had significant increases in population. So again, it's not a direct comparison. Nobody is saying that the way the NHS was founded wasn't absolutely brilliant and world-leading. But the honest fact is the NHS is no longer world-leading, and that's why we need to be flexible and have these open debates, not make any decisions just like that or follow any ideology, but have honest debates about the cause of the problem.
Can you see why it worries? Can you see why it worries people
years.
having debates like this? Yes, go on.
13
David.
years. That's you've been in for 13 years.
Well, I personally haven't.
No, of course not.
But the Conservatives, you mean one way or another, have been in coalition.
But you've got to acknowledge that until very recently, as Sajid says in his article, the whole mantra around the NHS would change it without touching it. And we've got to get over that fear of talking about it.
Finish your point, David.
Yeah, well, I'm in favour of touching it. I'm in favour of having a real look at how it operates from beginning to end, including social care, which you can't deal with the NHS unless you deal sensibly with social care, because that's where the big burden is.
And would you wouldn't agree with charging to see your GP, but what about a contributory principle being looked at, David Blunkett?
Well, I've always been in favour of the contributory principle. That was the basis of the national insurance scheme.
That contributory principle for me is paying taxation. So I am somebody on an MP's salary.
Would you support Gordon Brown saying 6% a year increase?
I'm in a situation where I'm a higher rate taxpayer and I pay towards that, and I'm quite happy to do so because I get good public services in Scotland. I get free prescriptions. I get the ability to see my GP.
Is Gordon Brown right on a 6% increase? That's, I mean, I think Keir Starmer is looking at around 2% increase. Is Gordon Brown right? Would you back that?
Well, we already spend £18 billion a year in the NHS in Scotland.
No?
But, well, certainly when it comes to paying staff, I absolutely want to see them paid more.
Right. I mean, I think according to the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, you're going to increase the budget by around 2%. So it's a lot less than what David Blunkett is talking about.
Can we please get over this idea that at the moment the NHS is free to all at point of reception? You pay.
When did you last pay for NHS services?
Sorry, when did you last pay for NHS services?
A very long time ago.
Can I now make the point I'm trying to make? is free to all at the point of reception. It's not. You have to pay prescription charges.
Not in Scotland, you don't.
No, but in England...
It's £9 in England for a prescription charge.
Lay aside Scotland for a moment. Let's have a grown-up debate. You have to pay...
So we just put Scotland out then, is that the idea?
You have to pay prescription charges. Most people have to pay for their dentistry. It is not free to all at the point of reception, and there'll be millions of people out there who will tell you that. And, you know, that is a myth that we have to abolish, and we have to ask, what do we do to make it fairer?
I think that comes as a surprise to my
Well, I agree with Dan's point about prescription charges, except, of course, people like me don't have to pay them because of age rather than income. The prescription charge situation is a farce, by the way.
Yeah.
I mean, it should be for long-term and very expensive need rather than based on age.
I do pay.
And it's just very silly. Well,
I do pay. I don't take free eye tests.
Well,
I don't take free dentistry.
I pay my
I don't
dental.
take any of the things that I'm entitled to.
I pay my dental charges as well, Anne, because I think it's fair that I should do, because I can well afford to.
All right.
But prescription charges overall are based on age rather than on need, and it's a nonsense.
But
well, we'll see whether any of these things are taken up. And just to correct myself, David Lind, it's 2.9%, I think, the increase that the Scottish Government is looking at.
Within a restricted funding settlement, of course, because Westminster holds a lot of the purse strings.
But it's still not 6%, which is what Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister... Gosh, am I getting the final word here? Let's have a look at this headline. We're going to talk about drugs. The Daily Telegraph. First-time drug users will not be prosecuted under police chief's plan. It's a headline from recently, a couple of weeks ago, and it does say that first-time users of cocaine and cannabis could avoid prosecution under plans being discussed. Now, the Scottish Government and police forces there have already taken this position. You can see this headline in the BBC News: warnings instead of prosecution for Class A drug users. That was from 2021. And the National Police Chiefs Council say it's not a policy, but it could be something being looked at. Let's introduce, and we'll speak to her in just a moment, the co-leader of the Green Party, Carla Denyer. Hello to you. The Green Party advocating complete legalisation of all drugs. But let's first of all have a look at this graph from 2021. Drug-induced deaths per million people. You can see there the figures for Scotland. Overwhelmingly higher death rate for drugs misuse deaths, and the figure has been rising since. I think there might have been a slight decline recently. David, the SNP, of course, are in government in Scotland. You announced this relaxed policy, more relaxed policy, as I was reading out earlier in 2021. How's it going?
Well, I think that this graph actually makes the case that prosecuting people out of addiction doesn't work. We need to move towards more of a public health measure.
That?
That's the opposite.
So at the moment, we're in a situation where, yes, absolutely, the drugs issue is particularly bad, particularly in my own city of Glasgow. That's one of the reasons why we want to look at safe injecting facilities. The reality is these people are going to take drugs. So if they're going to do that, let's get them into a place where we can get them in touch with social work, get them in touch with housing. But at the moment, of course, legislation for drugs is reserved to the Westminster Parliament. Now, we have asked time and time again, based on evidence, because that's what the international studies show, let's have a grown-up conversation that's evidence-based rather than that of dogma.
I know you want to talk about that, and I know you feel that this is something that should happen in Scotland. But I want to stick to this issue about whether your more relaxed policy about not prosecuting first-time users, that people get warnings instead, how's it actually working out?
Well, we're still in the very early stages of it, but the drug-induced deaths per million people...
Well, it's still going up, hasn't it, since you've introduced that?
So you wouldn't be in a situation where you're seeing people, drug-induced deaths from cannabis, which is what the police are saying that they will give a warning instead. But we need to have a grown-up debate about this, because we need to treat it as a public health issue rather than as a criminal issue.
But people are dying in the meantime.
Yes, and far too many, and that's why we need to look at serious reform of it, but it's got to be based on international evidence. And what we see in other countries is actually if you move more towards that, it does help in the long run. But
Which other countries?
Well, for example, let's look at, say, for example, Australia, right? Now, Australia, they introduced safe injecting facilities, and since then they've had nobody that's died of an overdose. We're in a situation where in Glasgow, every time I see a police car at the end of the lane in the city centre, I'm worried that it's someone who's died of an overdose. All
right, before I bring the others in, let's talk to Carla Denyer, Green Party co-leader. Carla, the Greens want to go even further. Not just warnings or not prosecuting. You want to legalise Class A drugs. Tell us your policy.
Legalise and regulate, because harmful drug use needs to be treated as a public health issue. the war on drugs that the Conservatives and the Labour government have been pursuing for 50 odd years has been shown time and again not to work. So yes, the Greens want to replace prohibition, which has failed, with a legalised, regulated system of drug control. Now, that would treat different drugs differently according to the level of harm that they cause. So drugs that don't cause much harm to the individual or to society would be subject to lighter regulation, but drugs that pose the highest risks would be subject to the heaviest regulation.
And what evidence have you got that it would work?
All the countries that have brought in this system, so countries like Portugal, France, Switzerland, have operated on a similar basis for some time, and that has had benefits. And the benefits are not necessarily a direct and immediate consequence of decriminalisation. It's that decriminalising and legalising changes the culture away from one where people are afraid to seek medical help because of the fear of being criminalised.
All right.
I think it's really important for us to understand, if I can just finish this point, that the most harmful drug use often arises as a result of people who have a background struggling in poverty, with mental illness, abuse, physical illness, or psychological trauma. Adding a criminal record into that toxic mix doesn't make things better; it makes them worse. So let's
talk to a former Home Secretary. David, you've dealt with this issue when you were Home Secretary. What's your view to what David Linden, what they've done in Scotland, and what Carla Denyer is suggesting? Because there are two things: there's the harm to the individual, and there's harm to wider society.
Well, there are three things that have been thrown up. Legalisation and decriminalisation are not the same thing.
They are not.
Treating people as patients and treating it as a health issue makes a lot of sense. It's déjà vu, because we were arguing back in 2003 these issues. The Advisory Committee on Misuse of Drugs, the Home Affairs Select Committee of the Commons, all came up with the suggestion that we reclassified so that actually we treated cannabis, and although later there was a introduction of skunk, which was a much stronger version, which did change the argument. It worked when we reclassified to cannabis to C. Yes. 20% drop in the use of cannabis by under 30s, and the reason for that was because the debate was about what really killed you, and Class A drugs do. So I would not have any truck with this idea of decriminalising or legalising Class A drugs. We need to tackle the pushers. We need to deal with the organised criminals behind it. And we need to have a sensible debate about what really harms you.
Right. Well, Carla, what do you say? David will have no truck in terms of advocating the policy you are for Class A drugs.
Well, he's simply not looking at the evidence. The Greens want to see evidence-based policy, and that shows that the kind of solutions that work to lower and to prevent drug deaths are, for example, safer consumption rooms. Yep. So these are spaces which are safe and clean. They're supervised by staff. They can provide clean needles, and they can direct people to other health services. Now,
that's
these kind
different.
Well, so let David.
Different.
Well, let David respond.
That is something, Carla, that we were doing 20 years ago, and we actually picked it up from Glasgow, David, because the experiments, when there was an absolute crisis where literally dozens of people were dying from Class A drugs, there was experiments in Glasgow. It then got shut down. It's been reopened again. That is sensible. Let's have a sensible debate.
David's absolutely right about that. I mean, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde did a really good evidence-based study on this that actually shows that moving towards that model does work. Right. The problem is the UK government are so intransigent at the moment, they won't even look at the reform of the 1973 Drugs Act.
I'm going to bring Miriam and Anne in. Miriam, first of all, are they being too intransigent on this issue? In fact, the direction of travel, sorry to use that hackneyed phrase, of both Labour and the Conservatives is to toughen up on existing drug laws.
Well, Of course we should have programmes that help people with addiction. Of course we should look periodically at whether drugs are categorised correctly. But that's a whole different thing to signalling through the law that we no longer think drug use is harmful. And, you know, drug use doesn't just harm the individual, it's a blight on society. It creates a whole criminal ecosystem that draws children to county lines, gangs. You know, it creates all sorts of criminality, and addiction destroys lives. And I think there's a difference between being understanding and compassionate and having programmes to help people get off drugs and using the law to signal this is no longer a boundary that society wants. And that would be a wrong thing to do.
Carla?
Well, I just have to say again that the solution to all of this is to treat harmful drug use as a health crisis, not as a crime. Criminalising people for possession does not solve any problems. It just creates more problems. We want to see a regulated system with, for example, drug consumption rooms, which the UK government is currently preventing. I know that many councils, including my own in Bristol and many in Scotland, want to bring in drug consumption rooms, and the UK government is standing in the way of that, standing in the way of evidence-based policy.
You've made that clear. What do you make of what you've heard, Anne?
I'm totally with David on the...
Excellent.
Blunkett.
You.
That couldn't have been clearer. But
I'm totally with David, David Senior, on the issue of not legalising hard drugs. When it comes to soft drugs, what people underestimate is this. They think it's all about supply. But just as supply fuels demand, demand also fuels supply. And therefore, you do have to tackle possession as well as supply. Now, there was an interesting study done in the University of Amsterdam, because, of course, they were pretty well the first to decriminalise, which showed that as soft drug use went up, which it did as a result of decriminalisation, so hard drug use also went up. It actually went up.
Well, as a gateway,
Yeah, and one of the reasons for that is two things. First of all, you're quite right, the gateway, a certain percentage of people will always go through. Secondly, of course, as far as the criminals were concerned, suddenly all their profits were in the hard drugs. So they peddled them. You know, they put all their emphasis on that.
I mean, you won't agree with Anne in the way that she has outlined her view, but why don't you agree with Carla Denyer? Why doesn't the Scottish Government go further and legalise Class A drugs?
Because we want to have an evidence-based discussion on this and look at it. And I think, you know...
So there isn't evidence for what Carla is saying?
Well, look, we can have that grown-up debate, but we need UK Government ministers to come to the table. This simply sticking their head in the sand and saying, oh, we're not going to come to the table.
But what's wrong? Because the Greens, you know, power sharing in Scotland, this will be the policy in the manifesto. Why haven't you looked at it?
Well, I'm not sure necessarily what the policy of the Scottish Greens on this is, but if we can
You're sharing power with them.
Yes, indeed we are, and there's a Butte House agreement, but that's different from their manifesto, of course. Now, the issue at the moment is that we are stuck in a situation that is far from satisfactory. We need to think bold. We need to look at some bigger issues, but we also need to look at what other countries are doing.
Well, nothing could be bolder than this.
It certainly would be bold, and that's why we've got to have a conversation about it. But having a conversation means that we've got to have UK Government ministers come to the table. Given that drugs law is currently reserved to the UK Parliament, they won't devolve it, they won't discuss it. So we're rather in a bit of a logjam at the moment.
Carla, can you persuade David that he should look at it, should look at his partners in government in Scotland at what they are proposing?
Yes, I, of course, can recommend that he speaks to his colleagues in the Scottish Greens. I know that they are very keen to see drug consumption rooms and that there are councils ready and waiting with policies
in agreement. David agrees with you on that, but I mean on your further policy on legalisation, because he doesn't think you've got the evidence for it.
Well, I think actually Anne Widdecombe inadvertently made my point on legalisation, which is that if it stays at just the decriminalised stage, then you are still giving criminals the opportunity to make a lot of money from an illegal trade. You know, you only need to look at, for example, the prohibition.
Legalise heroin, crack. Oh.
I mean, Anne's got her head in her hands, Carla. Anne's got her head in her hands, Carla, at the thought of legalising cocaine and heroin. So
I just want to make sure we're picturing the same thing here. I'm talking about legalising and heavily regulating. So for hard drugs that cause a lot of health and societal problems, make them legal. That means, for example, them being available from a pharmacy in a supervised way for people who have very, very hard to treat addictions for whom other approaches have not worked.
And
it doesn't mean selling it in a
first
corner
experience
shop.
of heroin gets it how? Gets it how?
It's recognising that there is currently an illegal trade, it's currently in the hands of criminals, and that
and
is
how
not
do they
good
get
for
it
society.
how do they get it if they're not in any health problem at the moment because they've never used it? How are they going to get it under your system? The answer is they'll get it underground, isn't it? That's the answer.
Well, they'll get it by
criminals.
people selling on prescription.
Yep.
That's what's happening in the States
right.
at the moment with prescription drugs. And,
as opposed to
nightmare.
in the US in the Prohibition era, where obviously there was no alcohol available and there was no harm caused by alcohol. We know that's nonsense. We know that prohibition doesn't work.
All right.
And that legalisation and regulation is a better way to protect people's health. If our priority is keeping drug deaths down, then our priority should be taking a public health approach.
Carla Denyer, thank you very much. We're going to talk about the Scottish Gender Recognition Reform Bill being blocked by the UK government. It's designed to make it easier for people to change their legal gender. UK ministers, the Secretary of State for Scotland, said that the draft law would conflict with equality protections that apply across the UK and impact safe spaces for women and children. There was a heated debate last week following the announcement of using Section 35, it's called, being used for the first time since devolution. Let's have a look at part of the debate, which involved our guest here, Miriam Cates, and the Labour MP, Lloyd Russell-Moyle.
I had an experience recently in a restaurant where a man dressed as a woman walked into the toilet, so I was on my own in the toilets. He stood behind me and stared at me into the mirror, looking at me in my eyes. Now, I have no idea if he intended me any harm, but my instinct, my evolved instinct as a woman, was to be frightened.
That speech was probably one of the worst transphobic dog whistle speeches that I've heard in an awful long time. The idea of linking trans people with predators, frankly, is disgusting, and you should be ashamed.
They were comments last week. Lloyd Russell-Moyle did make a point of order, we call it. He said that he'd written to you, Miriam, acknowledging the tone of my remarks. He said in the chamber yesterday was a mistake. This is last week. He went on to say, I recognise that I failed to control that passion during what was an emotional debate. I should have expressed my deep disagreement on what I believe is an abhorrent view in a more appropriate way. What happened exactly afterwards?
Well, he made a very passionate speech during which a number of my colleagues did actually try to intervene and defend me, which was very kind of them. And I've had an enormous amount of support from within the party and the wider public. He did a very strange thing, crossed the floor, came and sat near our benches. Now, I have no idea of the intent of that. And obviously,
I'll
that's
explain that in a minute.
But
he's explained it.
But I think the wider point here is this illustrates exactly the point I was making, that women are frightened to raise safeguarding concerns, to raise genuine cases where they feel frightened because of this, frankly, violent response that it provokes in people who oppose feminists speaking up about women and children's rights. And I think, we've been talking about having grown-up debates. That's not a grown-up debate. Grown-up debate is when you engage on the facts and the issues and the evidence. All right. And I'm afraid he completely failed to do that.
Just going to pause to welcome viewers from BBC News Channel. We are talking about the heated and passionate debate that followed the UK government's decision to use a Section 35, in other words, blocking a bill that had been passed by the Scottish government on the Gender Recognition Reform Bill. But what happened afterwards? First of all, let's explain. You said that Lloyd Russell-Moyle did this strange thing where he seemed to cross the floor or go to the other side. Now, he said that actually that was because Kirsty Blackman of the SNP was speaking. He said it's convention that you don't cross a speaker on the floor of the House. So he stood briefly at the bar of the chamber and then sat on the sidebar seats. It all sounds very technical, but this is his explanation, which are not party aligned, for the final speaker while waiting for the vote and looking at my phone. So he said it wasn't an uncommon thing to do. But what happened then at that point when he was sitting there?
Oh, well, one of my colleagues came to sit next to me to make sure that I felt safe, Paul Bristow, which was very good of him, and he's received an awful lot of support for doing that on Twitter. But I just, we can focus on the actions of one MP in the chamber, but we need to draw it into the wider point. And I think the problem with this debate is that as politicians, as the media, as people in public life, we are not speaking the truth about this issue. We are not being honest about the facts and the evidence. Yeah. And we are not speaking about the extreme danger that women and children will be in if it becomes become socially acceptable
that's quite a big
for
thing
men to be able to use women's facilities without challenge.
There are two things, Miriam, because as I've read out, Lloyd Russell-Moll explained that he should have used a more appropriate tone. Has he apologised to you?
He's apologised for his tone, but he's made very clear that he stands by his words. And again, this gets to the heart.
But can you see his point of view? I mean, you talk about a debate that needs to be civilised and reasonable. He has a point of view. He expressed it, he said, incorrectly. But do you understand that he has a point of view? It's a legitimate point of view.
Well, I would question the legitimacy of hearing a woman speak about feeling frightened in a particular situation and raising very clear evidenced points about how if you allow men to use women's facilities, women's prisons, etc., then people will abuse those safeguards, and to follow that up with that's transphobic bigotry. But as I said, I don't want to particularly draw attention to that incident because this is happening to women every day in their jobs, in their workplaces, and I am written to by, let's say, old women who are frightened of going to hospital because they can no longer expect a single-sex ward. And this is what I mean. We've got to be honest in this debate.
All right,
you can't change sex, OK? That is a biological fact. And the social consensus, the social covenant that keeps women safe only works if everybody buys into it. And that's the threat that we're facing now.
David, you see it differently.
Well, what I see is democracy. So in the Scottish Parliament, all 5 parties, MSPs from all 5 parties, including an MSP from the Conservatives, voted in favour of legislation that was within the competence of the Scottish Parliament. It was a manifesto commitment. And the Secretary of State for Scotland has used Section 35 of the Scotland Act for the first time ever to block that. And I consider that to be anti-democratic. It's a full frontal assault on Scottish democracy.
As you see, but what about the tone? What about the tone of the debate? That's what I really want to get to, because we have discussed this an awful lot, and I'll get to your next set. But why is it, or why does it seem to be so difficult to have a civilised debate without the sort of heat and personalisation that we've seen?
Well, look, I think the behaviour that we saw in the House of Commons last week was out of order. We need to keep in mind that through all of this, there are people who have very strongly held views, and I absolutely respect that. There are also people in the trans community who are incredibly vulnerable as well. So we need to take the temperature down on this. But the reality is that in Scotland, the Scottish Parliament has had this debate. I think it's over 32,000 consultation responses. This has been a debate that's been ongoing for 6 years. 2/3 of the Parliament voted for this legislation. Even my colleagues in it, it's widely
what are you going to do? What are you going to do now, by the way?
Well, I think Stephen Flynn was meeting the Secretary of State this morning. We have laid a prayer motion, and you can't necessarily amend it because Stephen Flynn and the SNP group have laid a prayer motion this morning to try and stop the Section 35 intervention, because we have been told that Scotland is the most powerful devolved parliament in the world, yet it goes to pass legislation that's within its competence. And Westminster comes in like some sort of viceroy and says, no, that can't happen.
Well, of course, it is the first time, and it may have been the wrong time to use it. I'm going to ask both Anne and David on that point. Let me just show our viewers inside the chamber, inside the House of Commons. I think we can see the Labour MP there, Carolyn Harris, standing up and contributing to the debate. We will be going to Prime Minister's questions in a few moments' time. David, first of all, should Labour be supporting this use of the Section 35, this ability for the UK government to block this bill on the basis, as Alistair Jack, the Secretary of State for Scotland, says, it would undermine equalities legislation?
Well, we put Section 35 in the Scotland Act.
I know.
There's no point in putting something in an act if you never expect...
But was this the right point to use it?
If you never expect to use... Well, I happen to think on this issue, very complex issue, that it was right to use Section 35. Okay. I'm sick and tired of identity politics. I'm sick of having to debate it over and over again. We need respect, we need genuine equality, and we need people to apologise like Lloyd Russell-Moll did for the outburst against you, Mariam, because actually you were expressing a perfectly reasonable point of view. There's a guy called Adam Graham, or he was Adam Graham, who's a 2-time rapist, who decided to trans and could end up in a women's prison in Scotland. This is just not acceptable.
All right, well,
it's
that's
just simply not acceptable.
So are Labour in the right place? Because they haven't actually stated clearly.
We're a bit all over the place on it, if I'm honest, and I do try to be. And we just got to be clear. Respect, equality, ensuring people are treated properly, that we don't alienate, that we care about how people are feeling and their development and the emotions they're going through. but not pandering to situations which put aside 50 years of equality campaigning for women.
Yeah.
That's what we're doing.
What would you like to hear then from Keir Starmer? When you say it's all over the place?
To say, look, sex and gender are entirely separate things. You can have someone who feels that they are of a different gender. You can help and support them.
All right.
But in the end, women's equality trumps it all.
Anne, was it right there? I'll come back to you, David, because we haven't got much time, but Anne.
Yes, it's absolutely right to use it. As David Senior correctly says, you know, if you put something in an act, it's there for a purpose, just as I would say is Article 16.
David, you're shaking your head.
Well, the issue here is, did the Labour Party still believe in devolution? Now, the Scottish Labour Party, and indeed Pam Duncan-Glancy, a Labour MSP, submitted Amendment 37 to ensure that it would be compatible with the Equality Act. And we're now in a situation where London Labour apparently hasn't decided whether it supports this. And is it really going to side with the Westminster government and have this full frontal assault on Scottish democracy? Because listening to David Blunkett, that's rather what it sounds like to me.
The
And people in Scotland would be watching
the 2010 Act, the Equality Act in 2010 was UK-wide. We support the UK Equality Act, and therefore we should be in favour of protecting people.
That's why Pam Duncan-Glancy's amendment was accepted.
That might arise from your recognition.
We've only got a moment. I've just seen Rishi Sunak take his seat in the chamber. Miriam, should Nadeem Zahawi, the Conservative Party chairman, keep his job?
Well, the Prime Minister has instigated this investigation by his ethics advisor. I think we should wait for the outcome of that investigation.
Should he step aside in the meantime?
No, I don't think he should, because he may be found that he hasn't done anything wrong, in which case, why cause that disruption? I don't think the investigation is going to take very long.
What should Keir Starmer ask about this, David Blunkett?
Well, he should ask what's changed in a week, because what Rishi Sunak said last week has changed dramatically.
It was addressed in full, he said.
Yes, exactly, to what was said yesterday. I'm afraid, and I quite like Nadeem, he's a dead man walking. I mean, by all means keep him as your party chair, because he won't be able to raise money, he won't be able to do anything while this is going on and afterwards. So good luck.
Is he a dead man walking, Anne?
I'm not sure. I mean, I always stand by innocent until proved guilty. There is an investigation. On the other hand, were I Nadeem at the moment, I would be saying this is a big distraction. I'll step aside, but I want to come back if I'm cleared.
I mean, it is a distraction, isn't it, for Rishi Sunak? I mean, is David Blunkett right? It's just a matter of time.
Yes, but I think there's a difference. Is the investigation going to take a week or a year? And clearly, if it's going to take a week, what would be the point of stepping down now? So I think it's about timing. You know, my understanding is that it'll be concluded quickly.
All right.
And that, you know, on that basis, I think he should stay.
Prime Minister's questions.
Mr. Speaker, can I start by wishing everyone a happy Burns night, especially to those celebrating in Scotland. And, Mr. Speaker, as we prepare to mark Holocaust Memorial Day, I'm sure the whole House will join me in paying tribute to the extraordinary courage of Britain's Holocaust survivors, including 94-year-old Arik Hirsch, who is with us here today. This government will legislate to build the Holocaust Memorial and Learning Centre next to Parliament, so the testimonies of survivors like Arik will be heard at the heart of our democracy by every generation to come. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Shockingly, 1 in 6 women in the UK have experienced economic abuse. This is not just about money, but the restricting of access to other resources like food, housing or work. It's the lesser-known aspects of coercive control. It affects my constituents, the Prime Minister's constituents, and every member across this House. What plans does the Prime Minister have to review in detail government departments and policies, the way that government departments and policies can be exploited by abusers to ensure that these loopholes can be closed?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady raises an important point, and let me assure her that this government is committed to tackling violence against women and girls. That's why we passed the landmark Domestic Abuse Bill, introduced new offences, for example, coercion, coercive control, stalking and others, and will continue to do everything we can to ensure women and girls feel as safe as they deserve and rightly should be.
Marco Longe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While I was disappointed that Dudley did not make the final cut in the latest Levelling Up funding round, I am, of course, pleased that we received the £25 million Towns deal, the brand new Duncan Edwards leisure facility, and a transport interchange project secured since my election in 2019. But our high street, Mr. Speaker, is on its knees. So will the Prime Minister meet with me and Dudley Council to discuss our levelling up bid and how we can ensure success in the next round?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is a great advocate for his constituents. And I'm delighted that, thanks to his efforts, Dudley has received £25 million from the Towns Fund. I know there will be disappointment about the Levelling Up Fund, but all bids, including that made by Dudley Council, can receive feedback to strengthen their bid for future rounds of funding, and I would be very happy to meet him further to discuss.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week we will remember the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust and all those scarred by genocide since, as we mark Holocaust Memorial Day. We must all commit across this House to defeat prejudice and hatred wherever we may find it. To work for a better future, we must find light in the darkness. I can also join the Prime Minister in wishing everyone a happy Burns night. Mr. Speaker, Zara Alina was walking home from a night out with her friends when she was savagely attacked, assaulted and beaten to death. Zara was a brilliant young woman, a trainee lawyer with a bright future. Her killer is a violent, racist, woman-hating thug, not fit to walk the same streets. No. But that's precisely the problem. He was free to walk the same streets. The inspectorate report into her case says that opportunities were missed by the probation service that could have prevented this attack and saved her life. Does the Prime Minister accept those findings?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this was a truly terrible crime. And as the Chief Inspector has found, the failings in this case, and indeed others, were serious and indeed unacceptable. In both of the cases that are in the public domain, these failures can be traced to failings in the initial risk assessment, and that's why immediate steps are being taken to address the serious issues raised.
Keir Starmer.
I'm glad he accepts those findings. The report also says that staffing vacancies and excessive workloads contributed to those fatal failures. And it makes absolutely clear this was not a one-off. As the report says, these are systemic issues in the probation service. They're clearly ministerial responsibilities. Does the Prime Minister accept those findings as well?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me outline for the honourable gentleman exactly what steps we are taking, and that's to ensure that mandatory training to improve risk assessments is being put in place. It's mandating checks with the police and children's services before a probation officer can recommend to the court that a convicted offender be given electronically monitored offence, and implementing new processes to guarantee the swift recall of offenders. And the action we are taking is already making a difference, as, for example, we see in the reduction of the number of electronically monitored curfews being given by the courts.
Yes, Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, it was Barking, Dagenham and Havering that tragically and fatally let Zara down. But across the country, probation services are failing. After a botched, then reversed privatisation, after a decade of underinvestment, it's yet another vital public service on its knees after 13 years of Tory government. I spoke to Zara's family this morning. It's hard to convey to this House the agony that they've been through. They say that the government has blood on their hands over these failings. He's accepted the findings of the report. Does he also accept what Zara's family say?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my heart, of course, goes out to Zara's family. He mentioned accountability. The probation services has taken action where failings have been found and where that has been appropriate. And with regard to the overall service, because of the extra investment we're putting in, there's now £155 million a year being put into the probation service so that we can deliver better supervision of offenders. There's also been an increase in the number of senior probation officers. But one of the other things we must remember, Mr. Speaker, if we do want to increase the safety of women and girls out on our streets, that we need tough sentencing. And that's why this government passed the Police Crime and Sentencing Act, which the honourable gentleman opposite and his party opposed.
In light of the case of Zara, I really don't think the Prime Minister should be boasting about the protection that he's putting in place for women. And I'm not going to take lectures from him about that. Does the Prime Minister agree that any politician who seeks to avoid the taxes they owe in this country is not fit to be in charge of taxpayer money?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to make my position on this matter completely clear to the House. The issues in question occurred before I was Prime Minister. With regard to the appointment of the Minister without portfolio, the usual appointments process was followed. No issues were raised with me when he was appointed to his current role. And since I commented on this matter last week, more information has come forward. And that is why I have asked the independent adviser to look into the matter. Now, I obviously can't prejudge the outcome of that, but it is right that we fully investigate this matter and establish all the facts.
Mr. Speaker, he avoided the question. I think anybody watching would think it's fairly obvious that someone who seeks to avoid tax can't also be in charge of tax. Yet, for some reason, the Prime Minister can't bring himself to say that or even acknowledge the question. Now, last week, the Prime Minister told this House that the chair of the Tory party had addressed his tax affairs in full and there was nothing to add. This week, after days of public pressure, the Prime Minister now says there are serious questions to answer. What changed?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I know he reads from these prepared sheets, but he should listen to what I actually say. Since I commented on this matter last week, more information, including a statement by the Minister without portfolio, has entered the public domain, which is why it's right that we do establish the facts. And Mr. Speaker, let me take a step back. Now, of course, the politically expedient thing to do would be for me to have said that this matter must have been resolved by Wednesday at noon. But I believe in proper due process. That's why I appointed an independent adviser, and that's why the independent adviser is doing his job. But the opposition can't have it both ways. The shadow leader, also his party chair, both urged me and the government to appoint an independent adviser. And now he objects to that independent adviser doing their job. It's simple political opportunism, and everyone can see through it.
We all know why the Prime Minister was reluctant to ask his party chair questions about family finances and tax avoidance. But his failure to sack him when the whole country can see what's going on shows how hopelessly weak he is. A Prime Minister overseeing chaos, overwhelmed at every turn. He can't say when ambulances will get to heart attack victims again. He can't say when the prison system will keep streets safe again. He can't even deal with tax avoiders in his own cabinet. Is he starting to wonder if this job is just too big for him?
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the difference between him and me is that I stand by my values and my principles even when it is difficult. When I disagreed fundamentally with the previous Prime Minister, I resigned from the government. But for four long years, he sat next to the member for Islington North. When anti-Semitism ran rife, when his predecessor sided with our opponents. That's what's weak, Mr. Speaker. He has no principles and just petty politics.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. For our most vulnerable children, school is often their principal place of safety as well as education. But as reported in my review of school exclusions for the government in 2019, the unacceptable and illegal use of off-rolling is still shutting a worrying number of children out of the classroom, out of learning and out of the protection they need from gangs, violence and domestic abuse. And whilst there has been some impressive and excellent work done by the Department of Education to address this terrible practice, what more can my right honourable friend do to ensure that we now permanently exclude off-rolling from our schools?
Prime Minister.
Well, my honourable friend raises an important issue, and the government is clear that off-rolling is unlawful and unacceptable in any form. And the Department for Education continues to work with Ofsted to tackle it. Where Ofsted finds it, it will always be addressed in the inspection report, and it could also lead to a school's leadership being judged inadequate.
We now come to Leader of the SNP, Stephen.
Mr. Speaker, let me start by echoing the sentiments of the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition in relation to Holocaust Memorial Day. Truly horrific crimes that we must never forget and endeavour to ensure are never repeated. May I also send my heartfelt thoughts, and indeed I hope those of all across the Chamber, to the firefighter who's in serious condition in Edinburgh at this moment in time, following the blaze in Edinburgh just a few days ago. Mr. Speaker, may I ask the Prime Minister, what advice would he have for individuals seeking to protect their personal finances? Should they seek out a future chair of the BBC to help secure an £800,000 loan? Should they set up a trust in Gibraltar and hope that HMRC simply don't notice? Or should they do as others have done and simply apply for non-dom status?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, let me share with the honourable gentleman expressing my sympathies to the families and indeed the firefighter who's currently in hospital. I'm sorry to hear that and wish him a speedy recovery. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud of the record of this government is supporting the most vulnerable in our society. Just this winter, helping all families £900 with their energy bills, raising the national living wage to record levels and ensuring that our pensioners get the support they need. That's what this government is doing to ensure financial security in this country.
I'm not sure what question the Prime Minister thought I asked, but that certainly was not it, Mr. Speaker. But let's be clear about this. This is now a matter of the Prime Minister's own integrity and accountability. After all, when there was questions about the Home Secretary, the Secretary, and concerns about her role in relation to national security, he chose to back her. Now the chair of the Tory party, he's choosing to back him despite a £5 million penalty from HMRC. And of course, he's seeking to protect the former Prime Minister despite his cosy financial relationship with the chair of the BBC. Is it little wonder that people in Scotland may well just consider the Tory party to be a parcel of rogues?
Mr. Speaker, what I'm standing up for is proper due process. That's why we have an independent advisor. It's right that the independent advisor conducts his investigation. That's how we will ensure accountability, and that's what I will deliver.
Rob Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Wales has almost 40 times more people than England waiting more than 2 years for NHS treatment, despite having less than 5% of the population. Sad case of devolve and forget, unfortunately, which does a disservice to my constituents in Delyn. Could the Prime Minister confirm that the UK Government remains concerned about the healthcare of the people in Wales? And given that the North Wales Health Board has had it for 8 years, could he come up with a way of putting the Welsh Labour Government into special measures?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the honourable gentleman highlights, the NHS right across our union is facing pressure because of some of the challenges of flu and COVID in particular, causing high bed occupancy this winter. We are focused on delivering on the people's priorities and bringing down the backlog. We've currently already eliminated waits of over 2 years, and as the honourable gentleman says, there's more to go. That's why our investment this week into mental health treatment will ensure that we can ease the pressure further in A&E, and I continue to delivering that across the country.
Sir Geoffrey Donaldson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I echo the comments of the Prime Minister in relation to Holocaust Memorial Day? And as we think of the situation in Ukraine, we also extend our best wishes to President Zelensky on his birthday today. Freedom of religion or belief is important in this country. Isabel von Spruce was praying silently outside an abortion clinic in Birmingham when she was arrested and questioned by the police, not about her written or spoken words, but about her thoughts. We value freedom of religion or belief in this country. Will the Prime Minister commit to examine the laws of the United Kingdom to ensure that this country remains a beacon for freedom of religion or belief across the world?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course, we believe in freedom of religious expression and belief in this country, but we also are balancing that with the rights of women to seek legal and safe abortions. That is currently being discussed in this Parliament. These matters are always matters of free vote, and I know members will treat them with the sensitivity that they deserve.
Dr. Liam Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Innocent civilians are being murdered in Ukraine on Putin's orders as we speak. And as we see in a warmed House of Commons, families are freezing because their electricity is being cut off by Russian forces. Putin believes that Ukraine is more important to him than the free world and is moving to a full war footing. So the Ukrainians must make gains on the battlefield, and the next 6 months are crucial. They need a full range of weapons, Mr. Speaker, air defence, artillery, longer-range missiles and tanks, and enough to make a real difference. The UK has shown great leadership on this issue. Can I ask, therefore, my right honourable friend to use every means at his disposal, domestic and international, to honour the courage of the people of Ukraine and to defend the whole world order, because ultimately that is what we're really talking about.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've made clear that the UK and our allies must accelerate our efforts to ensure Ukraine wins this war and secures a lasting peace. Last year, the United Kingdom provided £2.3 billion in military aid to Ukraine, the largest package of support of any European nation, and we will at least match that again this year. And as my right honourable friend knows, last week I announced that we would gift many battle tanks as part of the next major package of UK support to Ukraine, and I'm pleased that our friends and allies are preparing to follow our lead.
Dr. Rupa.
Mr. Speaker, London has it all. Prime property, shopping, schools, even the perfect time zone for money laundering. And while there has been movement with Russian oligarchs, it's not just them. We know that there are relatives of regimes that we all condemn on both sides of this House that are running bogus Islamic centres just as fronts to stash their dirty cash, amongst other things. So when will the NCA be adequately financed so we can be a world leader in anti-corruption, as we promised in 2016? Or is there a lack of political will to upset the apple cart?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable lady should know that we're currently in the process of legislating the Economic Crime Bill, which puts in place many more measures to allow us to tackle some of the issues that she raised, and also introduces the Economic Crime Levy, which will provide considerably more funding to tackle economic crime in the UK.
Sir McCartney.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Trans-Pennine Rail upgrade is underway, which is good news, with stations in Slough and Marsden getting improvements. But what's not such good news, Mr. Speaker, is the dozens of daily rail service cancellations by Trans-Pennine Express, which is causing absolute misery for my constituents, trying to get to work, trying to get to college, trying to visit family and friends. The franchise is up in May, Mr. Speaker. So does the Prime Minister agree with me? Enough is enough. If Trans-Pennine Express don't get to grips with this, we need to strip them of the franchise and get somebody in who will deliver the reliable rail services for my constituents.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we have been clear that the current service is simply not acceptable. Rail North Partnership is working with a company on a service improvement plan, and my honourable friend, the Rail Minister, is having weekly meetings with them. As the honourable gentleman points out, Trans-Pennine Express contract does expire in May, and whilst there are currently discussions about that new contract, if ministers conclude that the operator cannot be turned around, then other decisions may be made.
Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From Rwanda to deaths in the Channel and the latest scandal of missing children, refugees and campaigners have today gathered outside Parliament to highlight the impact of the hostile environment on people in the migration and asylum system. Rather than cruel gimmicks like Rwanda, isn't the best way of deterring channel crossings, saving lives and breaking the business model of criminal gangs to introduce safe and legal routes to claim asylum?
Well, Mr. Speaker, this just is about fairness. It's about fairness for those that seek to come here legally. It's about fairness for those who are here and our ability to integrate and support those who we want to. What we will do is break the cycle of criminal gangs, which are causing untold misery, leading to deaths in the Channel. And that's why we will introduce legislation that makes it clear that if you come here illegally, we will be able to detain you and swiftly remove you to a safe third country. That is the reasonable and common sense approach that the vast majority of the British public supports.
The Prime Minister will be aware of my concern that mental health patients should not be forced into accident and emergency departments when what they really need is specialist care. Can he say more about the extra money that's being made available for urgent mental health care facilities, and also what impact he thinks that'll have, first on the treatment of mental health patients, but also on the general situation in A&E departments?
Prime Minister. My right honourable friend is absolutely right. People in mental health crisis deserve compassionate care in a safe and appropriate setting, and too often they end up in A&E when they should be receiving specialist treatment elsewhere. This week's announcement is in mental health ambulances, crisis cafes, crisis houses, and mental health urgent treatment centres. Will make sure that patients do get the vital help they need whilst easing pressures on emergency departments and freeing up staff time. My honourable friend is absolutely right to highlight this issue. Our announcement this week will make a major difference.
As a trustee of the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, this week, I was honoured to hear from Leah Lesser, a Holocaust survivor who came to this country by herself at the age of 8 because her parents believed that the UK was a safe haven for vulnerable children. This week, I also read the government's own statistics, which said that there are 200 asylum-seeking, unaccompanied children who are missing from hotels in the UK. Ministers have admitted that they have no idea about the whereabouts of these children. So could I ask the Prime Minister, does he still think that the UK is a safe haven for vulnerable children?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the United Kingdom has opened up its hearts and homes to hundreds of thousands of people over the last few years, from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Ukraine, from Hong Kong, and provided refuge and sanctuary to many children in that process. But the reports that we have read about are concerning. Local authorities have a statutory duty to protect all children, regardless of where they go missing from. And in that situation, they work closely with the local agencies, including the police, to establish their whereabouts. And that's why it's so important that we end the use of hotels for unaccompanied asylum seekers and reduce pressure on the overall system. That's what our plans will do.
James Duddridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Constituents in Southend and Rochford very much welcome the energy bill support scheme that's helped 99% of households around the United Kingdom with rising fuel prices, despite Putin's barbaric war in Ukraine. Can the Prime Minister assure my constituents and indeed this House that he's committed to continue helping with the cost of living, not only this winter, but next winter?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right about this government's commitment to support all families with the cost of living. This winter, around £900 of support. But next year, as the energy price guarantee evolves, it will still be there to support families with around £500 of support. And this comes on top of record increases in the national living wage, worth about £1,600, and supporting our pensioners and the most vulnerable by inflating their benefits and pensions with inflation.
Clive Efford.
In 2021, the government enabled Yevgeny Prigozhin, former chef to Putin and founder of Wagner, to dodge UK sanctions to pursue a case in London against British journalist Elliot Higgins, who had exposed Prigozhin's link to Wagner. Prigozhin believed that silencing Higgins would get his sanctions lifted. The overriding of UK sanctions was approved by the Treasury when the Prime Minister was Chancellor. Prigozhin's English lawyers wrote that serving notice on Higgins, and I quote, will require Treasury approval. So what values did the Prime Minister apply when he allowed a Putin warlord to use our courts to try to silence a British journalist and undermine UK sanctions?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud of our record in leading, actually, when it comes to sanctioning those people connected with the Putin regime. I think at last count we've sanctioned over 1,000 people and frozen tens of billions of pounds of assets. I am aware of the case he's raised. We are looking at it. But there is, as he knows, OFSI, who deal with the licensing situations in these matters. But I'm happy to get back to him on the specific case that he raised.
Nicola Richards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I echo my right honourable friend's comments on the importance of Holocaust Memorial Day and welcome his renewed commitment today regarding the Holocaust Memorial and Learning Centre. Will the Prime Minister join me in encouraging members from across the House to sign the Holocaust Educational Trust Book of Commitment, which will be in Parliament today and tomorrow, pledging to remember the Holocaust, fight anti-Semitism and to support the important work of the Holocaust Educational Trust?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend, and as I said earlier, we will legislate to help build the Holocaust Memorial and Learning Centre next to Parliament to serve as a powerful reminder of the Holocaust, its victims, and where prejudice can lead if unchallenged. I also join her in thanking the Holocaust Educational Trust for their fantastic work, and I join my honourable friend in encouraging all members to sign the Book of Commitment, as I will be doing later today.
And this Slaughter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A week ago, my constituent, Ali Reza Akbari, was executed by order of the regime in Iran. In the 3 years preceding and the days following his murder, the UK government made little effort to protect the life or protest the death of a British national. Tomorrow, Mr. Akbari's family and I meet the Foreign Office Minister. They want to hear what help the government can offer them at this time of their greatest suffering. Today, this House wants to hear from the Prime Minister what sanction he will impose on the regime beyond the trifling steps taken so far. First and foremost, will he show some courage, follow the lead of the United States and the European Parliament, and prescribe the entire Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organisation?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the regime is prolonging the suffering of the family, and it is sadly typical of their disregard for basic human dignity. I've spoken before about my views in Iran when I was before the Liaison Committee, and Iran must now provide answers about the circumstances of his death and his burial. We have actually pressed the Iranian regime formally through their chargé d'affaires in London and the Foreign Ministry in Tehran, and will continue to do so until the family get the answers they deserve and have sanctioned several members connected with the case.
Redcliffe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister and the Chancellor for visiting Hampden and Haslingden just last week to hear about the transformative difference that the levelling up funding will make. This is a historic investment with over £40 million secured. So does he agree with me that we're delivering on exactly what was promised in 2019 to the areas that were forgotten the most, like Hampden and Haslingden? And will he visit once works are completed to see the difference himself?
Well, my honourable friend is a fantastic champion for her local community, and the results showed when the Chancellor and I were lucky to visit her last week. And as she pointed out, and as did many of the people that we spoke to, this was an area that had been forgotten, neglected for decades, but it's this government that is putting in the investment, spreading opportunity, making jobs and making sure that people can feel enormously pride of the place that they call home.
Sherman.
Mr. Speaker, does the Prime Minister realise that most people in my constituency think it's his role to keep our country safe? Yeah. Is he aware that in all those years I've been in Parliament, I have never heard a situation where our army and armed forces are so run down that the chairman of the Defence Select Committee and the Secretary of State for Defence both say our armed forces have been hollowed out and are unfit to put a division into active service? What's he going to do about that?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman seems to forget the fact that we've invested an extra £24 billion in our armed forces services. It's a record uplift in defence spending, ensures that we are one of the leading spenders on defence in NATO, and we will continue to ensure that we have one of the best equipped fighting forces anywhere in the world. And as we can see by the recent announcement on tanks, we continue to lead the world when it comes to standing up for not just our safety, but the safety of our allies around the world.
Sir Michael Penning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as a former firefighter, the whole House will pray for the firefighter that's fighting for his life in Scotland today. Our emergency services go one way into the danger while we come the other way, and our thoughts and prayers should be with them. On a separate note, Prime Minister, the Correspondent Borough Council, the Conservative-led council in my constituency, have done a fantastic job in building new houses, social housing and council houses. Can the Prime Minister assure me that we're not going to be pushed into Green Belt any more than we have already, and we can protect the children in my constituency?
Yeah. Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman, and I join him in praising his local council for ensuring that we build homes in the right places and make sure that our young people can fulfil the dream of home ownership. But he's also right to say that this government will always protect our precious green spaces, and the recent changes to our planning reforms will ensure that we can protect the green belt everywhere, and his local community and others will benefit from those protections as we keep our local areas beautiful.
Martin Day.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. UK and a Changing Europe has reported that at the end of 2022, 60% of voters said their cost of living had increased and 38% that their personal finances had been negatively affected from not being a member of the European Union. While OBR forecasts a 4% reduction in GDP, only 2/5 of which have already happened. Surely the Prime Minister would agree with me, with the electorate and the experts, that Brexit has only served to exacerbate cost of living and economic challenging facing these islands.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Russia's illegal war in Ukraine and the impact it's had on energy supplies has nothing to do with Brexit, Mr. Speaker. But what we are doing is ensuring that we can support families with those cost of living pressures. That's why we provided £900 of support this winter with energy bills. That's why we're increasing the national living wage to record levels. And we will continue to stand behind Britain's families until we can bring inflation back down to where it belongs.
Virginia Crosby.
Mr. Speaker, I know the Prime Minister will share my concerns at the news this morning that 730 people may lose their jobs at the Two Sisters chicken factory in Llangefni, one of the largest employers on Ynys Môn. What support can the government offer to both my constituents who are affected by this devastating news and the wider community at this difficult time?
Mr. Speaker, I'm very sorry to hear about the job losses that the Honourable Lady raises. My thoughts are with those affected and their families. I know how distressing that will be for them. I'm pleased to say that DWP has procedures in place to support communities when situations like this arise, and we will work very closely with her to do what we are doing everywhere across the country, and that's provide good, well-paid jobs for everyone, because that is the best way to build a happy and secure life.
Caroline Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Exercise is essential for both physical and mental well-being, but with spiralling energy costs, many venues, like the Freedom Leisure Centres in my constituency, are struggling to cope. While some sectors will receive extra support, the sport and leisure industry will not. If the Prime Minister agrees with me that this sector is vital to the long-term health of our communities, why is his government not providing them with the financial support they need to thrive?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course I agree with the Honourable Lady that exercise in leisure centres are important, and that's why we provided significant support to them during COVID and beyond. And with regard to energy prices now, the Chancellor has set out the new relief scheme that will run after the current one expires. It provides considerable support to all sorts of organisations up and down the country, and I'm sure it will benefit many businesses and organisations in her constituency.
I understand that the case referred to by the Right Honourable Member for Lagan Valley is currently before the courts. It is therefore covered by the House's sub judice resolution and should not be referred to in this House. It is, of course, open to any member to ask I waive the resolution.
We're going to leave the end of Prime Minister's questions there. Lindsay Hoyle making an announcement about a live case in court there to the Chamber. It was slightly longer than usual, more MPs getting to ask questions. Let me introduce our guest for this part of Politics Live. For the Government, Andrew Bowie, Trade Minister. For Labour, Shadow Attorney General Emily Thornberry, and the BBC's Chief Political Correspondent Nick Eardley. Let's start with the opening questions from Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, talking about failures in the probation service. Citing the case here, you can see BBC News of Zara Alina, killer, wrongly assessed as medium risk by probation. This was a woman who was murdered, a law graduate, after mistakes were made by probation staff, according to a report into this particular case. She was murdered by Jordan McSweeney 9 days after his release on licence from prison. He'd been wrongly assessed as medium risk by staff who were under mounting pressure at the time, according to the Chief Inspector of Probation, Justin Russell. A number of his questions were put to Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister. Emily, Rishi Sunak, in response, said government action is making a difference to these systemic issues within the probation service. Does that satisfy you?
It absolutely doesn't. I mean, what you need to do is you need to take a step back and see why is it the probation service is in such a mess. 10 out of 17 probation services are failing. And what happened was that this government decided to try to amalgamate the probation service with the prison service. Then they decided that was a bad idea. Then they decided to privatise it. Then they changed their minds. And systematically, they have been underfunding it. Yes, there have been systematic failures within the probation service. We know the probation service is failing. And frankly, I think that the answers that we got were complacent. That poor woman was a result of an entirely random attack. We know that any young woman on the streets of Ilford that night could have been at risk. And it is simply, if a government cannot keep us safe, then a government is fundamentally failing and really should be taking it much more seriously than they are at the moment. 10 out of 17 probation services in this country are failing.
Do you want to apologise? I mean, the government hasn't sent a personal apology to the family for the failures in the probation service. Clearly, ministerial responsibility over this.
Yeah, look, I think we've reached a new low if we're seeking to politicise this issue, and the Labour Party obviously are. It's a disgrace, frankly. This is a tragic case, an absolutely tragic case. And the thoughts and prayers of everybody are with Zara's family just now. The Prime Minister has accepted the recommendations of the report into this in full. We are taking action to ensure the probation service is fit for the future. But frankly, we should not be politicising what is such a sensitive and tragic
say that the
case.
Government had blood on their hands.
They said the probation service.
They did say the probation.
They said the probation service. And Keir Starmer was wrong in that, and he should apologise for that as well. Frankly, Emily, we need to move on from this. We need to learn lessons and make sure that this never happens again. But we should not be seeking to politicise what is an absolutely tragic case.
So Keir Starmer,
met the family.
Well, so Keir Starmer then turned to the issue of the Conservative Party chairman, Nadeem Zahawi. Nick, perhaps we can remind viewers and our guests that last week Rishi Sunak was asked about Nadeem Zahawi and issues around his tax affairs, and he gave a very short answer in which he said that actually Nadeem Zahawi's tax affairs had been addressed in full. We now know that new things have come to light.
I think we asked some questions about whether they'd been addressed in full last week as well. Very, very different tone from the Prime Minister today, because clearly things have moved on quite significantly from last Wednesday. This was always going to be uncomfortable for Rishi Sunak. I think it was uncomfortable for the Prime Minister. His answer there is simply that things have changed, and I got some new information. I was slightly surprised that Keir Starmer didn't ask him why, if he still had faith in Mr Zahawi, given that he didn't appear to have the full information when he turned up at PMQs last week. But there we are. I think it was an uncomfortable session for the Prime Minister, but no kind of fatal blow that I think will move this story on massively.
Right, Rishi Sunak, Andrew Bowie has said, we should let the process unfold because he's appointed the ethics advisor to look into it. But he clearly feels that there are now questions that need to be answered. Last week he didn't feel that. Is it right that a senior politician who has not given a full account of his tax affairs, pretty central core issue, to the Prime Minister when he was appointed, should stay in office?
I think it's right that the due process is followed.
No, but I'm asking you a different question. He didn't give a full account. We know now there's a problem with this, isn't there, Andrew Bowie? Because last week the Prime Minister said that Nadeem Zahawi had addressed his tax affairs in full. We now know that he hadn't addressed them in full in terms of the account he gave the Prime Minister, because we now know that he had to pay a penalty at the time that he was appointed as Chancellor. Yeah. Rishi Sunak said more information has come to light. Nadeem Zahawi, the Tory party chairman, did not give a full account to the Prime Minister. Surely that's a sackable offence.
This is exactly why it's been referred to the independent ethics advisor, because there are questions to answer, and it's absolutely right that due process is followed. As former Director of Public Prosecutions and an eminent KC like Emily is, I'm sure they understand the importance of due process and not rushing to conclude that somebody is guilty before that process is followed.
Sorry, but guilty of what? What is it? Because I keep hearing this, he's innocent until proven guilty. I'm just saying, quite simply, that Rishi Sunak could just fire him on the basis that he didn't tell him everything that he knew about his own tax affairs.
The Labour Party have been demanding for months that an independent ethics advisor is appointed so that cases like this can be referred and that decisions are taken based on the outcome of investigations led by the ethics advisor. Our case has been referred to the ethics advisor. We will then act on the recommendations of that advice as it comes back. Right, that's the process that should be followed.
Guilty of omission, then. Let's say you were called in tomorrow and you were going to be appointed Chancellor, Andrew, imagine. And you were asked to give a full account of your tax affairs and everything. Would you?
Incredibly quick and boring meeting that would be, I'm afraid.
Good for you, but you probably wouldn't admit, would you, that you were or had been in dispute with HMRC, maybe perfectly legitimate dispute, and that you'd had to pay a penalty?
Look, this is exactly why, to establish the full facts of the case, that it has been referred to the ethics advisor. We will then let the case, the process run its course, as is right and proper, and the Prime Minister will take a decision based on the outcome of this process. That is absolutely the right thing. It's what the Labour Party have been calling for us to do for months, and we're now following that process.
It is due process, and it'll probably be really quick, and then you'll know.
Can I just wheel this back a bit? There is a team, let's bear this in mind. There's a Cabinet Office propriety team that look into ministers' backgrounds before they are appointed. So they would have given a report to Boris Johnson before this guy became Chancellor, a report to Liz Truss before he was in charge of the Cabinet Office. He would have given a report to Rishi Sunak before Rishi Sunak made him chair of the Conservative Party.
And he said no issues were raised. He said no issues were raised.
First of all, we have his word for it.
We do.
But, there is a team whose very job it is to look into propriety. And if he has come to a deal with the Treasury, it's not a secret deal. The Cabinet Office propriety team ought to be able to look into that and ought to be able to have found it.
So do you want to wait? Do you want to wait until that has been done, this now latest process, to look at all these issues before calling for him to go?
What I'm saying is that I find it surprising, let me put it no higher than that all of these Prime Ministers did not know what was going on with Zahawi. And there is a team whose specific job is to give them information. And I don't believe that if they had done their job properly, and if the Prime Ministers had looked into this properly, that they would have appointed him to any of those jobs, in my view, and he should not be there. And I think it's another example of the weakness of the Prime Minister, that he was even appointed, let alone that he's been allowed to stay in post.
Nick?
Andrew, I wonder if you share the views of some of your colleagues in the Conservative Party, that this is just a cloud hanging over the party, and part of the reason that Rishi Sunak was seen as a clean break was the argument that he would move on from some of the scandals that we would have been talking about this time last year. And instead of doing that, he's basically having to battle another one, and he's not taking decisive action. This is an argument that some of your colleagues on the backbenches are making. Are they right?
It's quite clear. We would much rather be focused on the issues that matter to the British people, growing the economy, getting inflation under control, and all the rest of it. But it's really important in cases like this that due process is followed. We need to establish the facts of the case
when are they
before
going to
any
report
decision.
back then? When are they going to report back? How long are we going to have to wait?
Well, Emily, it's an independent advisor for a reason.
Let him answer.
By the way, an independent advisor that you had been calling for to appoint for quite some time.
Why don't they just ask him?
We have now appointed.
Couldn't he? If he wants to be, if we
so now the Labour position is that we should interfere in the process.
If it's an inquiry, he can just go along to Nadine Zahawi and say, show us the paperwork from the Inland Revenue, then we'll know what the situation is.
Emily, you're now suggesting that the government should interfere in the process to speed up the process or to influence the outcome? Frankly, what I'm saying is that the guy should go, and he shouldn't have been appointed in the first place. That's what I'm really saying.
Well, that's clear. There is an investigation or inquiry going on, I think, by Sir Laurie Magnus. Let's talk to my colleague Peter Barnes from the Political Research Unit to perhaps explain the ministerial code and the implications of breaking it.
Yes, so the Ministerial Code is this document which sets out the rules, the standards of behaviour that are expected of government ministers. And it's been suggested that Mr Zahawi may have broken it in quite a few different ways. The first is that there is this general principle that ministers have to uphold the highest standards of propriety at all times when they're acting as a minister. Then they also have to observe the 7 principles of public life, and they include honesty, openness, so being transparent about your personal interests and so on, and integrity, and people suggest he may have broken those. And then there are some possibly more specific ways in which he could have broken the ministerial code. One is that you're not allowed to allow a conflict of interests or even a potential conflict of interests to arise between your personal interests and your job as a minister. And people have suggested that being Chancellor at the same time as being in negotiations and subsequently paying a penalty to HMRC would count as a conflict of interests. So the independent advisor, sorry, Magnus, as you say, has got to investigate whether Nadine Zahawi did break any of these rules. Yes. Then he has to hand over his findings to the Prime Minister, and ultimately it will be up to the Prime Minister to decide whether he thinks Nadine Zahawi broke the rules. And if he does, then he will fire him.
Peter Barnes, thank you very much. Following on from that, Andrew, you may or may not have heard the interview with Lord Evans, Jonathan Evans, former MI5 boss and chair of the Committee on Standards in Public Life. He told the BBC that there are reports that Nadine Zahawi tried to close down or even take legal action against people who were looking into this. Does that sound like a person who's got nothing to hide and been completely transparent?
Look, I think the key word there is reports. And answer your question, no, I haven't heard that interview. And I keep going back to the point that we just need to let the process run its course. We need to let this independent ethics advisor do his job, report back to the Prime Minister, and then for the Prime Minister to take a judgment as to whether or not he keeps Nadine Zahawi in post. That is really important.
I think
the integrity of the entire process, that it is independent and that we follow due process.
The British public looking at this will say, this is just completely incredible. Here is a guy who has a £27 million asset and he's not even sure if he owns it. And then he forgets to pay tax on it. And then when people start looking into this, there are all kinds of
Well, the HMRC said it was careless, didn't they? They used the word careless.
Yes, careless is the word.
Not deliberate.
Careless is the word, and I haven't said deliberate, but I have said that he didn't know whether he owned a £27 million asset or not, and he forgot, therefore, whether he needed to pay tax on it or not. And yes, careless is the word. Right. I mean, one of the other questions the British public are likely to ask is, and this is a question of the rule of law, is are other people across the country being treated in the same way when it comes to not paying their taxes as Nadine Zahawi has been? I
don't know the answer to that, but I can imagine that HMRC is in dispute quite often with people who have complicated tax returns. Let me put it that way. Nick?
It's just, Andrew, you keep talking about the facts of the case and needing to establish them. There are some facts we know that Nadine Zahawi paid a penalty as part of his tax bill, and that he let the Prime Minister go into Prime Minister's questions last week to face MPs without knowing that. Do you think that's OK?
Look, that is all in the public domain. As a result of the information that came to light following PMQs last week, this case has been referred on. I think that shows the seriousness with which this Prime Minister and this government is taking this situation, and if he is found to have fallen foul of these in this report, the Prime Minister will, of course, sack him. But we need to let the process run its course and actually establish the facts before that.
Do you think he will be sacked if it's proved that either he paid a penalty or that he didn't give the PM the full story?
We need to allow the independent process to run its course and the Prime Minister to take a decision based on the results of that.
Well, what would you advise the Prime Minister to do? If the independent advisor comes back having found that Nadeem Zahawi didn't give him the full facts, do you think that the Prime Minister ought to sack him? That's a simple question. Answer that.
Unlike the Labour Party, we actually believe in the independence of this process. You say you
there
believe
is
in the
advice
independence.
given
I'm not going to advise the Prime Minister based on a process that I don't know.
I think you're being asked for your opinion rather than whether you'd literally advise Rishi Sunak on this issue. I want to talk about something else that we discussed before Prime Minister's questions, which is the Scottish Gender Recognition Reform Bill, which was passed by the Scottish Government with support of was cross-party support in Holyrood, but has been blocked by the UK Government using for the very first time Section 35, part of the Devolution Act that Labour brought in, which is halting it. They say it undermines equalities law across the UK, and therefore it is justified in being used. Do you agree? Was it right to use for the first time, Andrew, Section 35 of the Scotland Act to stop this bill?
Yes, it was. And, you know, actually, we look to, and we have offered the Scottish Government the opportunity to address the elements within the Gender Recognition Act Scotland that does impinge on reserved UK law, regards to the Equalities Act in particular, so that we can get it into a position that works for everybody across the United Kingdom.
All right.
It's really important, though, in a devolved situation like this, that legislation passed by one of the devolved legislators on, by the way, any issue does not impinge on reserved legislation. And that is why the Secretary of State for Scotland he did not want to be in this position. We don't want to be interfering in the devolved affairs.
But you've taken it and you've made that clear.
Absolutely.
Does Labour, do you agree and support the government's action to block this bill?
So, obviously, the gender recognition legislation is something which has devolved, and equalities legislation is something which is
absolutely.
Which is from the UK
so
government.
Were they right to block it?
So the question then is, if there is any difficulties across border, then how do we resolve that? And it does seem to me that the way to resolve it is for the two governments to speak to one another, to sort it out between themselves. Now, I hear that there may be some problems in relation to the Equalities Act because of the Gender Recognition Act. Well, I would like to see that. I would like to see the government advice on that. And, you know, I think that a proper discussion could take place.
All right.
The last thing we're getting at the moment is any proper discussion. We are getting people screaming at each other.
Right, well, except that in the Labour Party, we don't quite know what the Labour Party's position here, the Labour Party,
Our position,
the UK. Well, hang on. Do you agree with David Blunkett, who was sat here in that chair just before? In fact, he said that actually he does agree with the government blocking this bill. He does agree with Section 35. He said the Labour Party are a bit all over the place on it, if I'm honest, and I think they should be clear. Is he right?
No, he's not right. The situation is simply this, that we think that Section 35 need not be used because the government can discuss it with the Scottish Government and those difficulties can be. And the way it's going to be resolved is either by the two governments discussing it or by it going to court. And it does seem to me that the grown-up way of dealing with this is for the two governments to discuss it. And you know what? For both sides as well, to remember that what this is really about is the most vulnerable people in our society who are trans people, and to stop screaming at each other and to sit down and discuss it in a sensible way.
Well, should the government compromise in just the way Emily's saying? Emily doesn't agree with Lord Blunkett.
So the statement of reasons as to why we took the decision last week was published at the same time as the Secretary of State gave his statement on laying the Section 35 order in the House. In terms of having to use Section 35 and not working to compromise, as soon as the Scottish Parliament passed that Act, there was a certain time limit imposed that we had to either take a decision whether to stop the legislation before it went for royal assent or not. We are seeking to speak with them. We are not saying that they cannot proceed with the vast majority of what is in that bill. But on the areas where it impinges on reserved legislation, we just want to have a discussion and bring it back so it can work for everybody.
Well, on the discussion, the tone of the debate, we talked about that too, Emily. Rosie Duffield, Labour MP, your colleague, has complained. She wrote a pretty extraordinary piece last week saying she doesn't actually feel able to speak freely on this issue. She was heckled by other Labour MPs. Do you have sympathy for her?
I think she does speak freely on it. I mean, I've spoken to her many times about it behind the scenes, and we have had these conversations. And what we need to do, of course, is speak to each other, listen. More important.
What did you make of her comments then in Unheard that she wrote about the how she feels in the isolated? She said by her colleagues.
I don't think it's fair to say that she's isolated. As I say, I think many of us have discussed. I find that the debate last week was not Parliament at its finest.
No.
And frankly, I was in the chamber. I thought that I heard one person saying, "No, Rosie, that's not right." I'm told that was two people. But to be honest, it was. Honestly, I was there, and the bottom half of the chamber, where I believe you said, the Tories there were shouting at the Nats so loudly, so loudly that I really found it very difficult to hear what was going on.
Do you think there are some colleagues that should calm down?
And after a while, I had had enough of it, and I simply left.
Wasn't a Conservative MP that went and sat on the other side of the chamber to intimidate a fellow member of Parliament, who, by the way, was sitting in the studio earlier on today? Your MPs.
All right, I'm afraid we have to stop because it's the end of the programme. From all of us here, bye-bye.